the chief of the implementation support section at the Corruption and Economic Crime Branch. We are honored to have you with us, wrapping up a very exciting 20-so hours on where we traveled around the world, looking at our organization's work with and for the private sector. Work that is implemented by our network of offices around the world. We started 20 hours ago in Kenya, hearing from them, from our anti-corruption team in Kenya about their work with the private sector. We moved on to Mexico. We then traveled to Colombia. We went to the World Bank in DC. We went to Myanmar, Pakistan. We had a session recently with the MENA region, with different projects in the Arab countries. And so this is a very exciting moment where we can sort of wrap up the discussion and take stock. And we're very excited to have you here. We also had our executive director speak at a special session earlier today, at a high-level session in the plenary, about our work in connection with Principle 10 of the United Nations Global Compact 10 Principles. And so I think we've set the stage now for our wrap-up session. We've had a pretty loyal audience over the last day with us, and I see slowly more and more are joining in. We will welcome everyone in at any time, and we do welcome questions through the chat area that we will periodically visit and respond to. And so please, I'd like to also kind of mention that our team spans across the world, have been relentlessly working with us on these sessions and have done an excellent job. Particularly this session, we're accompanied in the background by Siemens and Alex from our team in Vienna, and I'm also part of the team led by Giovanni. So without further ado, Giovanni, I'd like to kind of point you and the audience to the title of our live session at the moment, which is 15 years of fighting corruption with the private sector. And I wonder, and maybe you can enlighten us, why are we marking 15 years of work with the private sector when this whole summit is here to celebrate 20 years, not 15, but 20 years of the Global Compact? Please, Giovanni.
Thank you, Sigall, and also from my end here in Vienna, a warm welcome to all those who have been following this 26-hour journey from our side, an excursus of the anti-corruption work and how it relates to the private sector. Warm welcome to friends and colleagues who are watching us now from the Americas, on the other side of the Atlantic. Good morning to them. Good afternoon, good evening for those who are in Europe or in Asia or further east. And again, from our end, a big word of thanks to the UN Global Compact. This summit was organized long ago. We were all supposed to be, or most of us supposed to be in New York, participating in the proceedings personally, and they have redesigned the format of this event, even maximizing the potential that this event has now provided to all of us. So our warm welcome to the host, and thank to the host, and thank to Sigall and the team that you've been leading through this exercise for the past 26 hours. Now, back to your question, Sigall, you're right. Why are we talking about 15 years of anti-corruption with the private sector in the context of a 20-year anniversary of the UN Global Compact? There is a discrepancy there, an apparent discrepancy. Of course, we need to take a step back. We need to look at what happened 2 decades ago. Now we are entering the decade of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. 20 years ago, they were the Millennium Development Goals. The SDGs, as we know them, were more than a dream. The MDGs, that was the acronym used by everyone. And that was the realization of the then Secretary General back in the year 2000, that the Millennium Development Goals required an involvement that had to go way beyond governments, that had to involve all sectors of society. And that's when the UN started to realize that we needed a platform for the values of the United Nations and the business world to come together around the Millennium Development Goals. And that's what led to the creation of the Global Compact in the year 2000, around three fundamental values: labor, environment, and human rights. If you look at the catalog of the 10 principles of the Global Compact, you will see the first 9 principles covering these 3 main areas. And then you may wonder, how come that anti-corruption was not included in that initial catalog? It wasn't. So basically, the private sector started to commit to pursuing its legitimate profit by respecting human rights, by respecting labor standards, and by respecting and protecting the environment. But the private sector did not commit to pursuing business by not engaging in corruption or by resisting, opposing corruption. Something revolutionary happened 3 to 4 years later. The governments realized that the world did not have a single legally binding instrument to fight corruption. There was the United Nations Convention Against Corruption that came into being in October 2003, adopted by the General Assembly, open for ratification in December 2003. And all of a sudden, a few months later, in 2004, the 10th principle of the Global Compact came into being. So the timing here is all but coincidental. Obviously, governments made the most solemn commitment to fight corruption, and the private sector found itself behind. Private sector just committed to 3 important values of the United Nations and had, for some historical reasons, left the 4th behind. So with the adoption of the UN Convention Against Corruption, the private sector found itself challenged to match the commitment made by governments, and they responded to the challenge by adopting the 10th principle and by identifying the United Nations Convention Against Corruption as the underlying legal instrument for the 10th principle. And it's indispensable. This is a often neglected passage. The UN Convention Against Corruption is articulated in 71 articles. It is a booklet, and it can go to as much detail as you want. The 10th principle is 2 lines. So how do you breathe life in those 2 lines? How do you determine and distill measures, concrete advice, concrete steps that can be taken to fight corruption in the private sector by the private sector as inspired by the convention? By looking into it, the convention was seen certainly with great enthusiasm by the business community. It was seen as finally something that could realize the legendary level playing field. Governments have to play by the same rules. There will not be governments with more or less stringent measures on anti-corruption, at least on paper. Reality tells us sometimes otherwise. The Anti-Corruption Convention does what its predecessor instruments, also more limited in geographic scope, never did. It criminalizes not only giving a bribe, but also soliciting a bribe, what the 10th principle calls extortion, when public officials request a bribe for business to do its job. But the convention goes beyond. The convention, for the first time, realizes that corruption is bad also if public money is not involved. We have offenses like bribery in the private sector. We have offenses like embezzlement. So the convention looks specifically at the private sector. The convention introduces the notion at the global level, of course, of corporate liability. Not only the administrators of a company, natural persons, but also legal persons can be sanctioned as a result of committing offenses of corruption, to the point of being dismantled. So the link, and all these came into being exactly in 2005, when the convention entered into force after having received 30 ratifications. This is the reason why in the year 2020, we're talking about 15 years of fight against corruption together with the private sector. Now, these 15 years are a relatively short space of time if you look at them in abstract. But a lot of ground has been covered. And I'm not saying that the job is done. I'm not even saying that half the job is done. But it's also fair to recognize that 15 years of engagement with the private sector through the UN Global Compact that opened that gate, for the whole United Nations, have led the private sector to some important points of awareness that are all but to be taken for granted, particularly 15 years ago. Corruption is a crime. Corruption was not necessarily considered a crime 15 years ago. Corruption by the private sector was sometimes considered as a normal, sometimes indispensable way of doing business. You may be caught. If you're caught, you get away as if you had a speeding ticket. This is no longer the case. Corruption is absolutely a crime. It must be criminalized by each government that has ratified the UN Convention Against Corruption. But beyond that stage, beyond the stage of raising awareness, we also need to recognize the considerable progress made by a number of companies that we like to call champions of integrity, who have quickly gone from words to deeds. And I would only mention a few examples, and I apologize if I leave out other equally important examples. But over the past 15 years at Unodc, we could count on the active cooperation, on the active support of such giants as PricewaterhouseCoopers, Microsoft, Siemens. Siemens in particular has been supporting our anti-corruption work for over a decade now, and they've been doing so consistently. And our gratitude goes specifically to these representatives of the private sector who have quickly understood the advantages of the UN Global Compact, the advantages of the 10 principle, and have immediately become very precious allies in this work. Thank you, Sigall.
Thank you very much. This has been very eye-opening, and I'm sure a lot of private sector practitioners joining us today have a much better understanding now of the different frameworks that apply to their work and the different sort of tools that they could find for guidance and support of their work on cleaning up, leveling the playing field. I think perhaps you might want to go a little bit, dig a bit deeper and give us a little bit of a better understanding of the different linkages between the private sector and the fight against corruption. So going beyond sort of, the tools and the institutions and the norms and the conventions, more into the practical, everyday kind of linkages. Where is corruption and the private sector meeting each other? How does it, in your view, express itself?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that this question is particularly topical because the recent crisis has shown two things. First of all, that the arrangement that we have in place may be very, very fragile. And second, that other crises may come, more likely than not. Many news, natural crisis, and we need to be better prepared. And when I say we, I talk about public and private spheres coming together. Now, like I said before, 10, 15 years of work, of anti-corruption work in and with the private sector have covered a lot of ground. I think that we are definitely past that dichotomy, that narrative whereby the private sector is either only bad, they corrupt public officials to walk their way into economies, into emerging markets, or the private sector is exclusively the victim of corrupt public officials who want a bribe for them to be able to do their job. We are definitely past that stage. And I'm not saying that these dynamics no longer exist. They do exist. But in the spheres where we operate, we hope that the private counterparts with which we talk and the public counterparts with which we talk have understood that a true work for integrity cannot be done together with the private sector. Look at the crisis of this day. What do we see? What have we seen in these days? We've seen, apart from the immediate impact on health, which is the biggest catastrophe, which is the biggest tragedy, and we cannot neglect or understand for a moment the too high number of victims that COVID-19 has generated. But the second wave, the second impact has been felt by business, has been felt by the economy, has been felt in particular by the small and medium enterprises, has been felt in particular by the informal economies, has been felt in particular, as the Director General of ILO said this morning, by the 2 billion people who rely for their daily subsistence on informal means of economy, of informal labor, or not a single working contract to justify their survival. Well, these obviously are the companies, or the sectors of economy that require state help, that require public health. There is an estimate that says that $8.5 trillion will be necessary for the world to recover in the next 2 years from the economic consequences of COVID-19. So the impact on the economy has been particularly detrimental, and this is the large part of the economy that definitely requires help, requires support. And then there is, on the other hand of the spectrum, there are those companies, those few companies that operate in the field of medical goods, services, supply, distribution, delivery, online purchases. Well, these companies have seen their businesses thriving. So the victims of the economic crisis as a result of the health crisis need to be able to have access to these rescue economy packages that have to reach their intended beneficiaries. And what is the biggest obstacle there between public money being distributed and those in need receiving it? The intermediate steps and the various exposure to corruption that you have in those steps. On the other hand, we have seen some companies, those in particular, thriving from what has been happening while doing their legitimate business, for instance. We have seen a bit too many cases of price gouging. We have seen a bit too many cases of goods and services that went out 10 times because in higher needs during the economic crisis. So what is the role of what is the interplay between the private sector and corruption? Is no longer delinked by the interplay between the private sector and the public sector. We have seen, and we would like to see more of the notion of co-regulation as opposed to the notion of deregulation that we saw in the 80s in some economies in North America in particular. The identification and distribution of economy and emergency rescue packages cannot be done only by governments. It has to be done in consultation with the beneficiaries, frequently in the private sector. Business associations, consumer associations. This is a very important step. We would like to see a lot more of it. We have seen, for instance, that these associations of companies and of consumers have not been consulted in most of the countries that have immediately deployed multi-billion-dollar economy rescue packages. But there is also a lot that the private sector can do within its own ranks. We hear frequently of collective actions. We hear frequently of public-private partnerships. Well, what we could see a bit more here is private-private partnerships, because within the business community, there is a great discrepancy between the big multinational companies that will survive, are still on their feet, and they will be even stronger on their feet, and the smaller companies. Now, there could and should be more solidarity within industries. First of all, companies taking sides. Self-policing is a bad word, but it says very clearly that if you see something wrong happening in your industry, marginalize, exclude your competitor or even your supplier who is not engaging in ethical behaviors. Big companies have large compliance officers, they have chief compliance officers, they have a big team of lawyers. Small companies obviously don't. SMEs certainly do not or cannot afford an army of lawyers working permanently for them. This is the solidarity chain that we would like to see. The big companies helping the smaller one establish code of conduct, ethic parameters, measuring compliance with those ethic parameters. We would like to see, for instance, some more anti-corruption clauses in the contracts between the major multinational companies and their suppliers, intermediaries, distributors. So this is how we see the interplay between corruption in the private sector in the future. There is a lot that the private sector can do and should do together with governments, with the clear understanding, don't get me wrong here, the primary, I don't want to talk about primary responsibility, secondary responsibility. Everyone has a shared responsibility. But of course, establishment of laws is a government responsibility. Enforcement of the law is a government responsibility. Compliance with the law is every citizen's responsibility, including corporate citizens. And there is a lot more that the private sector can do within its own ranks, as I've explained before.
Thank you very much. I mean, this really highlights how, you know, the private sector is not a separate entity to civil society, really. It's part of civil society, especially when you think of economies that, you know, 90% of the businesses are SMEs. SMEs are, you know, the moms and pop shops and bigger, of course, but they're every one of us. And this is the survival of a whole economy is dependent on SMEs being able to function in a fair way, in a competitive way, in a clean way within society. And so it puts things in a different light. We often think of, you know, big multinationals as sort of pulling the strings of economy, but really businesses are at the receiving end, the beneficiary end, the vulnerable end of this chain where corruption can interfere at every level. So I think it was excellent to illustrate that. My next question to you, you actually answered. I was planning to ask you about the future, but maybe you want to add a few words. You did mention, what is the future of our engagement in the UN with the private sector in terms of fighting corruption? You touched upon this, but I mean, I think maybe there's a bit more.
Sure, I touch upon part of it, but there is more. There is more because if I understand your question well, Sigall, you're talking about the private sector and the United Nations now, how the UN could better engage with the private sector, and vice versa, and how can the private sector can better engage with us? Because one of the things that we frequently hear when we participate in meetings with company representatives, they do not understand our structure, and I cannot blame them. The UN structure is complicated. The UN structure is layered. They don't know exactly which door to knock on if they want guidance, advice on this or that issue. And here again, credit is due to the UN Global Compact for creating 20 years ago that one single portal, that one gate that collects business participants, and through the global coin, through the switchboard function of the Global Compact, then if there is an ethical dilemma about labor or about human rights or about human trafficking or about any other aspect or corruption, now companies are channeled to the right expertise in the United Nations. And this is again something that we didn't have 20 years ago, and for which the Global Compact deserves again a lot of credit. But there is more. If we look at the past 20 years, companies could sign up to the UN Global Compact, could associate themselves with the blue flag, could enjoy the reputational benefits that come with that association, and had little to do in return. This has changed over the years, and it's changing even more. And again, credit to the Global Compact colleagues. Today, the Global Compact has 11,000 business participants. It's a lot. But 9,000 have been delisted over the years. So 9,000 who signed up to the United Nations values did not prove to be up to those values and lost the benefit of that association. So back to your question, why and how can we intensify and strengthen the engagement between the private sector and the business and the United Nations in the future? It's an alliance. It's an alliance based on same values, same principles, and same rules of engagement. And that's perhaps where we should be working a bit harder. Let me bring things back for a second to the UN Convention Against Corruption, which was my point of departure, and again, what breathes its life into the 10 principles of the Global Compact. 187 governments have ratified that convention. Is it enough to formally subscribe to a principle, to a set of principles? Is it enough? It's not. You have to prove it. And in a space of years, from the adoption of the convention, governments gave themselves a mechanism to prove and demonstrate their commitments. It's called the review mechanism for the convention. This is something we don't have yet for the private sector. But I know very well from our regular exchange with our friends with the Global Compact that they're working on it. They're working on making the requirements for companies to be part of the same team a bit more stringent, as a way of demonstrating the commitment, as a way of playing by the same rules of engagement. Only that. But beyond this, our hope for the future, thinking about the 40th Leaders Summit, today they were celebrating the 20th Leaders Summit, is that indeed in the future, in less than 2 decades possibly, the private sector will have identified indeed champions in its own ranks, role models, and will have brought down that distinction at the economy between the public and the private sphere, who is responsible for what, who is the victim, who is the perpetrator, and be really part of a real alliance among peers. In the respect of their distinct roles, which have to be distinct, which have to be different, being profit-oriented is not bad, it's actually the essence of the economy, but being responsible citizens is equally good and makes more business sense. The goal, the ideal is that indeed the level playing field, which is still today an aspiration, will become a reality as a result of a better, stronger engagement between the UN and the business community.
Thank you very much. We actually have a very interesting follow-up question directly following what we've just discussed. And I mean, you mentioned that the different sectors have their roles, but they should work together as an alliance. And I think one example of this is the G20. So the G20 has, at the governmental level, its anti-corruption working group, but it also has a subgroup called the B20, where the businesses are represented, and another subgroup called the C20, where the civil society is represented. Now, this is not just a lecture, this is actually a question coming from the audience, particularly from our colleagues in the STAR Initiative. And they are asking, how can we at UNODC collaborate with the G20 and its anti-corruption working group, as well as the B20 and the C20, to leverage this kind of work?
Thank you, Sigall. It's a very valid question and a very timely game, because before the lockdown that in Europe hit us in mid-March, in China, in Asia earlier, in the Western world a little later. Before the lockdown, my last travel, before travel became forbidden, was indeed to attend the anti-corruption working group of the G20 in Riyadh, because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now holding the presidency of the G20. So I can respond from experience of this instance and before to this question. The G20, of course, is an initiative of 20 countries. The membership of the UN is broader than that. But the experiences that we can collect from these 20 countries are very valuable, because these 20 countries come from all the possible regional groups in which the membership of the UN is politically and geographically articulated. Now, the G20 as its presidency, so we as United Nations do not have any convening power over the G20. We do not have any secretariat role over the G20. We have an advisory role. And over the years, we have seen, and it's not only UNODC, obviously. The World Bank is there. The International Monetary Fund is there since recently, I understand. The OECD is there. So other international origin organizations have the same advisory role. But when it comes to anti-corruption, when it comes to the working group on corruption, the advisory role the UNODC has been playing at the request of the presidency, at the request of Saudi Arabia now, Italy, the incoming presidency, and so on and so forth, rotationally. But I can see that our role has become more and more prominent. The G20 generates high-level principles, then eventually feed into the annual ministerial meeting due to take place this year in October, November, again in Saudi Arabia, if international travel restrictions are lifted. And I can tell you that the contribution that we have been making at the request of the President are significant, are substantial, including in how these high-level principles are to engage the private sector through the B20 and the civil society through the C20. So the channel of communication is there, is wide open. We are regular observers and advisors to the work of the G20, and not only during the meetings of the working group, but even more so in the intercessional periods, if you allow me this very jargon word, during which the papers are generated, the principles are formulated, and the communication between the G20 and Unodc flows on a weekly basis.
Excellent question, excellent response, and very, very enlightening again. I wanted to also add perhaps that over the last 24 hours, we've been sharing with the participants quite innovative projects and new ones that we in Unodc are doing with the private sector. And I think that also illustrates part of the future vision of how we can work together with the private sector. We initially, there was sort of a need to build trust. Obviously, the private sector doesn't usually get approached by the UN, especially not outside of the Global Compact umbrella. And I think and we've heard about the challenges over the last 24 hours with respect to building trust between the UN and private sector. But I think once we've bridged that gap, we've seen excellent examples of very fruitful collaboration between us at Unodc and our different country offices and the private sector. And very, very frequently, the private sector had agreed through us to work closely with the public sector, which again, another gap to bridge. And I think that our role as convener between the public and the private sectors has proved to be very essential. So while we collaborate directly, we're also using our convening power and our legitimacy and to bring together the parties. And we've heard examples from around the world. Again, I mentioned Kenya, Mexico, Colombia, MENA, Myanmar, Mexico, and some of the other countries, Myanmar, that we're working with. And we've really seen that in the course of the last 15 years, we went from very small scale, kind of isolated projects with the private sector to really huge funding-wise, but also year-wise, very long and deep projects. We have a network of projects, and they're also interacting, and we're sharing experiences among the different projects in the different countries. So I think this is also, maybe you want to relate to this, Giovanni, in terms of our future work with the private sector.
Indeed, Sigall, indeed. We have been able to bring down that wall that frequently is there between private and public spheres, to see each other as in opposition, one regulating the other, one limiting the other, one trying to find ways around. And indeed, the neutrality that the UN can offer has enabled the trust-building step, which is probably the most difficult to do. You mentioned again a number of countries where this is happening, where this was possible. And we should not neglect, again, I said it throughout my answers, but I wish to say it again, that it was indeed the private sector that funded the work that you and I are just describing now, because the main donor for this work that is happening in the various fields that you have been mentioning so far is indeed a company, is indeed Siemens. And when we talk about the importance of becoming a champion of integrity, the importance of leading by example in your industry and beyond, we don't necessarily mean fund the anti-corruption work of the United Nations, but the benefits of that fund go way beyond the benefit for the donor, because here we are affecting and we are building and we are strengthening public-private partnerships in a variety of countries around the world, from Latin America to Pakistan to Southeast Asia to Myanmar, several countries in Africa. This is something that would not have been possible without the far-sighted vision of some individuals in the private sector in particular.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think also it illustrates how the partnership with the private sector isn't just about, you know, funding, but also a true partnership of co-leading developments, important developments in the world. And I think it's very, we are very fortunate to have here in our booth at the moment, Sabine Zindera, who is a vice president at Siemens and is heading actually the Siemens Integrity Initiative that we are partnering with for the last 15 years. And I would like to invite Sabine to make a comment. She is here on the chat area. And Sabine, would you like me to let you in to the booth with a mic, or would you like to comment from the chat area? There's a couple of buttons I need to press otherwise. Yes, okay, there I see you are requesting. This is a tricky platform. I think you need to press something to request again. There it is. Okay, great. Yes, we can hear you.
So good to see you, and hello. My brief comment would be, I mean, where would we as the private sector be without you? Without the United Nations, without the OECD, and the major stakeholders in this collective action arena. Giovanni and Sigall, I mean, we have really come a long way, and it's more than 10 years now that we have driven collective action through various channels, through long-term initiatives on the ground, through our engagement in the G20 and B20, through our engagement in promoting the UN Convention, OECD Convention. And you know that I have been a big fan of the UN Convention for many, many years, because I think it is really the supranational instrument, and it is the door opener for all of our conversations on the ground. And as so many countries have signed and ratified the UN Convention, it is always a good starting point to talk about it, right? And that is also the reason why we have funded so many projects in that deal with that topic. And of course, that funding, and I would like to mention, that is based on the settlements that we had with the World Bank and the European Investment Bank, because of our own scandal that we had more than 10 years ago. And that was really an alarming call, a wake-up call that we had. And it changed our way to operate, and it changed the way how we support things. And for me, one thing is really very clear. There is only one way to do business, and that is clean business. And we all need the level playing field, because in doing so, we can also support at the same time financial sustainability. We can support that taxpayers' money, all of our money, is well spent. And with that, we can also support growth and real nice development of nations. And that is, sometimes I think, you know, if my father, for example, asks me, what do you do in work? Then I say, Father, I don't work. It's just, I do what I love, right? It is, of course, there are days where I also think it's work, but most of the time I'm truly energized about the chance to be part of this thing.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I don't know, Giovanni, whether you'd like to comment or respond, or just welcome Sabine here to the booth.
First of all, a warm welcome to Sabine. It's a pleasure to see you, though remotely and virtually now. Indeed, you said it all. There is a long history that brings together your company and the Union Office on Drugs and Crime. You have indicated what triggered Siemens' interest. but this is the Union Office on Drugs and Crime. We all are about reform. We all are about amendments. We all are about a second chance, also in the most severe criminal justice system, and it's all about making good use of that second chance. And Siemens is an example that we hope many others will follow.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And maybe, I don't know if you already had done, but I would also like to take this moment to think about Dimitri Flassis, who more than 10 years ago, together with you, Giovanni, when we first met, I mean, he was such an inspiring person and helped us to find our way in collective action. And I will never forget that.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you. It is indeed a presence that we still feel in these corridors. Yeah. Of course, we are here today celebrating an important accomplishment of the Global Compact, the 20th anniversary. But some of us, you, myself, Dimitri, were there for the 10th.
Yes.
Global Compact Leader Summit, exactly 10 years ago. And that was another important milestone. Whatever the father of the UN anti-corruption work did is still with us.
Yeah, exactly.
He's still with us. He still lead us for many years to come.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you for that, and I wish you all the best for the remaining rest of this conference.
Likewise, Sabine. It was a pleasure to see you. Thank you for taking the time and being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks also from my side. I also wanted to mention that the enthusiasm, Sabine, that you brings to our work, which we share, of course, is another component, another aspect of this partnership, the partnership with Siemens, between Unodc and Siemens, that we are very honored to benefit from. And this again goes to the general question, what can the private sector do with us, where the private sector really shares the values of the UN, and it's not just a tick the box exercise of compliance, but a real belief in these values, as you just expressed here. I think that is where the synergies can happen, and that is where transformation can start. And so really, this is what it's about. I think there's a lot of questions here. We have another 15 minutes. We'll take a couple more.
Sure.
But those of you who have asked, what can we do beyond laws? What can we do beyond more regulation? I think it's thinking about values. How do we want the next generation to live, in what kind of world? And I think when we answer that question, we have to start thinking about ethics. We have to start thinking about fighting corruption, whether through laws, through other transformations, through our beliefs, through our education. And please, Giovanni, there is a question specifically on a post-COVID world. And it comes from Arya Dev in India, who's asking whether, what is the business case for collective action on anti-corruption issues in a post-COVID world?
Well, the post-COVID world has certainly demonstrated, first of all, let me take a step back. We are not yet in the post-COVID world. There are large parts of this planet, and I'm thinking of many countries in Latin America. I'm thinking of many countries in Africa, where the situation today is as it was in the Far East at the beginning of the year, as it was in Europe 3 months ago. So we are yet to see what the post-COVID world will look like. We are yet to see how a highly globalized world, a highly globalized economy will recover, certainly not at the same time from the crisis. But this crisis is showing us a few things. It's showing again the fragility of the system. It's showing us that, as I was mentioning before, a large majority of companies, of small businesses, have disappeared or are struggling. I don't know how many jobs have been lost, and we know that not all those jobs will be recovered, whereas others have been in that industry, in that sector, that is profiting. Well, what is the business case there for collective action? more solidarity. This is a word that we heard several times this morning when the Director Generals of the International Labour Organization, the UN Environmental Programme, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Executive Director of Unodc shared a panel this morning, the 4 highest UN authorities responsible for the 4 issues areas of the Global Compact. They talked about more solidarity within industries and across industries. It is important to start building those safeguards also within the private sector. Is it important to, we see now that in many industries, these economy rescue packages are not reaching the intended beneficiaries, also the small companies, because there are corrupt steps. Do we have robust whistleblower mechanisms that accompany the delivery, or the identification and the distribution of these economy rescue packages? Do we have this robust whistleblower mechanism within companies, and not only in the relation between public and private world? Do we have, again, in the large companies, do we have the opportunity of these large companies supporting the small ones with mechanisms that otherwise they could not afford? These are all things that collectively companies should do together, and the responsibility there lies obviously with the large ones, who have to look up and down, have to look at supply, have to look at distribution, have to look at intermediaries, and need to take care of their own chain, which is now called value chain more than supply chain for a reason.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. There's a couple of other questions since we have 10 more minutes. With your permission, Giovanni, I'll take a couple more questions. And so a question comes again from our colleagues in the STAR initiative at the World Bank, in mentioning that UNODC worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers a few years ago to develop a publication on compliance. And Elsa is asking whether we have any other upcoming knowledge tools that we are working on in cooperation with the private sector. Sure.
Well, Elsa remembers very well those days when it was again an initiative that came from Dimitri, was mentioned before, and our enlightened colleagues from PricewaterhouseCoopers. We did something which in its simplicity seems like something that we should have thought of many years before, but no one did. PricewaterhouseCoopers helped us review, take all the companies of the Global Fortune 500 and see if and what kind of integrity measures they had within their ranks. Do you have code of conduct for your employees? What happens if those codes of conduct are violated? Do you report internally? Do you have disciplinary mechanisms? Do you report to public authorities? The results were quite alarming, even among the 500 most profitable companies in the world. And I'm talking about a number of years ago. There are indeed other companies that we're working on at the moment. Some agreements are yet to be formalized, and therefore I will refrain from naming them. But there is one in particular that is helping us update this anti-corruption e-learning tool that we developed with the Global Compact a number of years ago. It's a very simple 6 modules or so that places employees or even managers of private sector of companies before the most traditional ethical dilemmas. I'm at a conference, what kind of gift can I accept? What kind of hospitality can I accept? What does conflict of interest mean? Where do I cross the line? And the responses to those ethical dilemmas are to be found in some articles of the convention. Now, this study is an initiative between UNODC and the Global Compact. We generated this tool. It's online. It's available. It can be used. It is now available in 31 different languages. It has such a success among companies. And let me be clear here. We don't give anyone a clean bill of health. It's not that as if a company takes all its employees through this UN training course of integrity and anti-corruption, then they can showcase that the clean bill of health. Certainly not. But it's part of their compliance process. It's part of their reporting process. It's part of what we call moving away from a system that only sanctions companies for doing something bad, the blacklisting system, and start thinking about some whitelisting system. If there are companies that really do well, that really demonstrate well, can we not think about some laws that give them preferential treatments when it comes to receiving major public contract awards and so on and so forth? This is one of those elements that is building in that direction. But back to Elsa's question, yes, we are in discourse with other companies, particularly law firms, and this is an industry that we haven't explored that much in the past, where on a pro bono basis, also very important to say, and these companies having approached us rather than the other way around, they're ready to support our work, they're ready to contribute their time, their intellectual capital, their knowledge, to support our knowledge products, and more will be coming up soon.
Yeah, and let me add also that all the projects we presented in the last 24 hours, funded mostly by the Siemens Integrity Initiative, are projects where we bring together different private sector actors to work with us on knowledge products. So we're developing training modules that are contextualized to the different countries we work in, to build capacity of the private sector, to also help training different ethics officers in the private sector. So there's a lot of knowledge products that are contextualized, country-based, that we are at the moment developing with many different actors from the private sector in those various countries. So that's, I think, very interesting to follow as well. We've got a very interesting question, and I think perhaps we might have to wrap up with this one, coming from Alma from Myanmar, who is asking, Giovanni, how can we encourage or motivate the private sector, and in particularly these SMEs that we spoke about? How can we motivate them to enhance their integrity and anti-corruption measures in countries where there are no legislative requirements to enhance integrity? What can we do? And the follow-up she asks here is, in these situations, how can we identify the champions within these private sector organizations in such environments where there's no legislative requirements?
Thank you, Sigall. I'm particularly glad this question comes from Myanmar, a country where I was privileged to live and work for 3 years at the beginning of my career with Unodc. So I am not very familiar with the legislative situation in Myanmar as it is now. I know very well how it was in the recent past, a decade and a half ago. And definitely, if you don't have an infrastructure regime around you, a legal regime around you, the incentives become very, very little. I mean, we heard Siemens before candidly admitting that they went through a major corruption incident that affected all their operations around the world that was 15 years ago. Other equally gigantic corruption failures, we had them in Enron in the United States and Globecom and so on and so forth. So even in highly regulated environments, corruption does happen. And the first step there towards integrity, more than the incentive, is the deterrent. Is the law that makes corruption a crime, is the law that may lead a company to its non-existence by being dismantled. And then once that minimum level is reached of minimal compliance with the law, then you can go above it. And then you can look at the champions of integrity, who not only do what the bare minimum prescribes, but they go above it. Now, in an environment which is not yet fully regulated as it can be a developing country, any developing country, not only Myanmar, of course. Well, there are business associations, there are local chambers of commerce where businessmen and businesswomen meet, including the SMEs, and I'm aware of some of such associations in Myanmar, and that's where we should start talking. That's where we should start bringing our voice in. We start explaining that compliance with the law is not a choice, is not an option, it's an obligation. And actually, those who want to prove to be champions of integrity need to demonstrate that they're ready to go above and beyond compliance with the law. Minimum as those requirements might be, and even not fully regulated as they may be in a developing country.
Great. I was trying in parallel to answer some of the questions on the chat since we're running out of time. Pia answered your question on the chat, and we'll stay in the booth to answer the questions, and you can keep asking these questions in in the next couple of minutes. But we have to respect Mr. Giovanni's time and those participants here who signed up for an hour's discussion. And so I think without further ado, we will wrap up. We've had a great pleasure to have Giovanni here with us for the last hour, and a very interactive, exciting, and dynamic participation here from the audience. I want to thank again the Global Compact for this amazing event and opportunity to run a booth. It's almost like a conference on our own, kind of in parallel to the plenary over the last day and a half. It was very enriching. The platform also has been very friendly to us. Giovanni, perhaps a couple of last words, and I'll stay on here on the chat just to answer a couple of questions after that.
Only to renew my gratitude to our host, the UN Global Compact. In addition to the last question that I just came to my mind, of course, the Global Compact has local chapters, which are a resource for colleagues operating in Myanmar or other countries where companies come together. So that is also another opportunity, not only Chamber of Commerce or local assembly, but also the local chapters of the Global Compact. Our host today, celebrating 20 years of very good work and looking ahead, and this is the most promising part of it. This has not been felt by anyone as a point of arrival, but as a very important stepping stone towards the future. I'm grateful to the Global Compact. I'm grateful to you, Sigall, and all the colleagues from around the world who have populated this space of 26 hours. I'm very grateful to the audience, all those who took the time in their different time zones to stay connected, to listen to us, to ask questions, to engage. Of course, we remain at your entire disposal, also beyond this space, for any questions, any form of collaboration we can explore. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. The booth has a static display with a lot of our publications as well, so you can move there through this application and see some of our materials. And do get in touch. You have our contacts on the website, which is also connected to this booth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Giovanni. Have a nice afternoon, morning, evening, depending where you are. Thank you.
Bye.